What you are about to hear in the next 15 seconds is something most people are never meant to question, because everything you have been told about how the human mind works was designed to keep you obedient, predictable, and emotionally manageable, not free, not self-aware, and not fully conscious of the invisible forces shaping your thoughts, fears, desires, and decisions every single day. The biggest lie about the human mind is the idea that you are rational, because research and lived reality both show that most of your choices are made long before logic ever enters the conversation, with your brain operating on instinct, emotion, conditioning, and unconscious pattern recognition, while your conscious mind is left to justify decisions it did not actually make. You were taught that awareness equals control, but the truth is that awareness often arrives after the fact, because your brain evolved to keep you alive, not to tell you the truth, meaning it constantly edits reality, filters information, and bends perception in ways that feel natural, but serve survival rather than accuracy. This is why you can feel confident about beliefs you never chose, afraid of things that pose no real threat, attracted to people who harm you, and resistant to opportunities that could change your life, because your mind prioritizes familiarity over truth and safety over growth, even when that safety quietly destroys you. From the moment you were born, your brain began absorbing patterns from your environment, learning what was rewarded, what was punished, what was acceptable, and what was dangerous. And long before you could speak, you were already forming neural pathways that would shape your self-image, emotional responses, and expectations of the world. What they never explained is that repetition creates reality inside the brain, because the more often a thought, belief, or emotional reaction is triggered, the more real it feels, regardless of whether it is accurate, healthy, or helpful, which is why lies repeated often enough begin to feel like truth. Your brain does not ask whether something is true before responding to it, because it asks whether something is familiar, and familiarity feels safe, even when it is harmful, which explains why people stay in toxic environments, repeat destructive patterns, and defend beliefs that hurt them. Another lie you were told is that your emotions respond to reality, when in fact, your emotions respond to interpretations, meaning two people can experience the same event and live in completely different psychological worlds based on how their brains assign meaning. This is why perception is power, because whoever shapes interpretation shapes emotional reality, and whoever shapes emotional reality shapes behavior, which is why governments, corporations, media, and institutions invest so heavily in controlling narratives rather than facts. Your brain fills in gaps constantly because it hates uncertainty, and when information is missing, it invents explanations based on past experience, cultural conditioning, and emotional bias, creating stories that feel complete even when they are deeply flawed. What makes this dangerous is that once a story is formed, your brain defends it aggressively, filtering out contradictory information and amplifying confirming evidence. Because being wrong feels threatening to identity, and identity is something the brain protects at all costs. This is why changing your mind feels uncomfortable, because it is not just about updating information, but about destabilizing the mental structures that make you feel coherent, consistent, and safe in the world. You were also lied to about free will, because while you do make choices, the options you notice, the impulses you feel, and the preferences you experience are heavily influenced by subconscious processes that operate below awareness, meaning your freedom exists within boundaries you did not design. Your brain is constantly predicting the future based on the past, and these predictions shape what you notice, what you ignore, and how you react, creating a self-reinforcing loop where expectation influences perception and perception reinforces expectation. This loop is why trauma feels persistent, because once your brain learns to expect danger, it begins interpreting neutral situations as threats, keeping your nervous system activated long after the original danger has passed. It is also why confidence and insecurity become self-fulfilling, because the brain looks for evidence to support its internal model of who you are, feeding you experiences that confirm what you already believe. What they never taught you is that your mind is not a mirror of reality, but a simulation, because you do not experience the world directly, but through a model your brain builds using sensory input, memory, emotion, and prediction. This means that what feels obvious, certain, and real to you is actually an internal construction, not objective truth. And while this construction is useful, it is also deeply manipulable. Advertising understands this because it does not sell products, but identities, emotions, and futures, embedding associations in your mind so that desire feels spontaneous, even though it was engineered. Social systems understand this because they do not control people through force, but through norms, expectations, and internalized rules that feel self-imposed, even when they were externally taught. Even your sense of self is not fixed, because the brain updates identity based on feedback, experience, and context, meaning who you think you are today is not who you were 5 years ago, and not who you will be 5 years from now. The unsettling truth is that most people never question the architecture of their own minds, because questioning it threatens the stability of the world they believe they live in. And this is only the surface, because once you begin to see how deeply conditioned your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions really are, you start to realize that the human mind is not designed to liberate you, but to manage you. And until you understand that system, you will continue living inside a reality that feels like your own, but was largely built for you. Once you move past the surface myths about the human mind, the first unsettling truth reveals itself quietly. Most of what you believe you think freely is actually pre-selected, framed, and filtered long before it reaches your conscious awareness. Because the brain does not experience reality directly, but through layers of interpretation built from memory, emotion, fear, reward, and survival instinct. Your brain is not a neutral observer of the world, because it evolved to keep you alive, not to show you truth, meaning it constantly edits reality in your favor, exaggerating threats, minimizing uncertainty, and prioritizing information that confirms what it already believes, even when those beliefs limit you or quietly sabotage your potential. What they rarely explain is that perception is prediction, because your brain is always guessing what will happen next based on past experience, and then adjusting sensory input to match that expectation, which means you are not seeing the world as it is, but as your nervous system expects it to be. This is why two people can experience the same event and walk away with completely different emotional realities, because their brains are running different predictive models shaped by trauma, upbringing, conditioning, and repeated reinforcement, turning objective situations into subjective emotional truths. The mind's greatest deception is that it convinces you these interpretations are facts, because once an emotion attaches to a belief, the brain protects it aggressively, filtering out contradictory evidence and amplifying confirming details, making false narratives feel solid and unquestionable. This mechanism is why fear feels rational when you are afraid, why jealousy feels justified when you feel threatened, and why anger feels deserved when your identity feels challenged. Because emotion is not responding to reality, but to the brain's internal simulation of it. What makes this dangerous is that the brain rewards certainty over accuracy, because certainty reduces cognitive load and emotional discomfort, meaning your mind will cling to simple explanations even when they are wrong, distorted, or incomplete, just to avoid the anxiety of not knowing. This is how stereotypes form, how rigid beliefs harden, and how people become emotionally invested in ideas that no longer serve them, because abandoning a belief feels like losing stability, identity, and safety all at once. Another lie you were told is that your thoughts originate from you, when in reality, many thoughts are automatic responses generated by neural patterns shaped through repetition, environment, and reinforcement, appearing in your mind fully formed without your consent. The brain does not ask permission before producing a thought, because its job is to respond quickly, and speed requires shortcuts, which means many of your thoughts are recycled reactions rather than original insights. This is why the same doubts return, the same fears repeat, and the same internal arguments replay, because neural pathways strengthen through use, not truth, making familiar thoughts feel convincing simply because they are frequent. What they don't tell you is that attention is the fuel that keeps these patterns alive, because every time you engage a thought emotionally, you reinforce the neural circuit behind it, teaching your brain that this pattern matters and should be preserved. Over time, these reinforced loops become automatic mental habits, shaping how you interpret people, situations, and yourself without conscious effort, turning your mind into a predictable machine that reacts before you can reflect. This is where the illusion of personality forms, because what you call who I am is often just a collection of well-worn neural patterns responding the same way to familiar triggers, creating consistency that feels like identity. The problem is not that the brain creates these shortcuts, but that you were never taught how to question them, interrupt them, or rebuild them, leaving you at the mercy of unconscious conditioning that feels personal, but is largely mechanical. Another uncomfortable truth is that emotion drives reason, not the other way around, because the emotional centers of the brain activate before conscious reasoning, and logic is often recruited afterward to justify what you already feel. This is why arguments rarely change minds, because when beliefs are emotionally protected, evidence feels like attack, and the brain responds defensively rather than rationally, reinforcing the very ideas being challenged. What keeps this system running is the brain's need for coherence, because it hates contradiction, and when faced with information that threatens identity or worldview, it distorts perception rather than allowing internal conflict. This distortion can take the form of denial, minimization, rationalization, or projection, all of which preserve emotional stability at the cost of accuracy and growth. What makes this manipulation subtle is that it happens internally, meaning you are both the creator and the victim of the illusion, mistaking familiarity for truth and comfort for correctness. The mind also lies about control, because while you feel in charge of your decisions, many choices are influenced by mood, hunger, stress, fatigue, and emotional memory, all of which bias judgment without announcing themselves. This is why you make decisions you later regret and defend decisions you no longer believe in, because at the moment of choice, your brain was prioritizing immediate emotional relief rather than long-term alignment. Another myth is that awareness automatically leads to change, when in reality, awareness without emotional regulation often changes nothing, because knowing a pattern exists does not weaken the emotional reward attached to it. The brain does not abandon a pattern unless a new one feels safer, more rewarding, or more efficient, meaning transformation requires rewiring, not willpower. What they don't teach you is that your brain is a pattern completion machine, constantly filling gaps with assumptions, memories, and emotional shortcuts, which is why silence feels threatening, ambiguity feels uncomfortable, and uncertainty feels unsafe. This need for completion explains why your mind rushes to conclusions, assigns motives, and creates narratives even when information is incomplete. Because an imperfect story feels better than no story at all. As these narratives repeat, they harden into belief systems that shape behavior automatically, influencing who you trust, what you pursue, what you avoid, and what you believe you deserve. The most unsettling realization is that much of your suffering comes not from events themselves, but from the interpretations your brain attaches to them. Interpretations learned quietly over time and rarely questioned. This means reality is not happening to you directly, but through a lens shaped by conditioning, emotion, and expectation. And until that lens is examined, every experience will reinforce the same internal conclusions. The brain is not lying to hurt you, but to protect you, because protection feels safer than truth, and familiarity feels safer than freedom. And this is where the real danger lies, because a mind that prioritizes comfort over accuracy will choose predictable pain over uncertain growth, keeping you trapped in realities you did not consciously choose but have been silently maintaining. What they never warned you about is that once the human mind accepts a false framework about itself, it begins organizing reality around that framework automatically, because the brain does not search for truth by default, but for consistency, meaning it will defend familiar beliefs even when those beliefs quietly limit your perception, your behavior, and your sense of possibility. This is why the most powerful lies about the human mind are not obvious distortions, but subtle simplifications. Because when you are told that your thoughts are fully conscious, your decisions are rational, and your identity is stable, your brain stops questioning the invisible forces shaping your reactions, allowing unconscious patterns to operate without resistance. The uncomfortable truth is that most of what you think, feel, and do happens before you are aware of it, because the conscious mind is not the driver, but the narrator, arriving after decisions are already in motion, creating explanations that feel logical even when the real cause was emotional, instinctive, or conditioned. This illusion of control is comforting, because believing you are fully in charge protects your ego from uncertainty, but it also keeps you blind to the deeper systems governing your behavior, such as emotional memory, subconscious threat detection, social conditioning, and learned associations formed long before you had the language to question them. What they lied to you about is the idea that knowing something automatically gives you power over it, because awareness without emotional integration changes very little, and the brain can intellectually understand a pattern while still being emotionally controlled by it. This is why people repeat behaviors they claim to understand, stay in cycles they can explain, and make choices they promised themselves they would never make again. Because insight alone does not rewire the brain, repetition does. The mind is not persuaded by logic as much as it is trained by experience, meaning whatever you repeatedly feel, react to, and tolerate becomes normalized, regardless of whether it aligns with your values or intentions. This is how people adapt to anxiety, dissatisfaction, emotional neglect, and constant stress without realizing it, because the brain's primary goal is survival, not happiness, and it will choose familiar discomfort over unfamiliar peace every time. What makes this even more unsettling is that the brain confuses familiarity with safety, which is why environments, relationships, and routines that harm you can still feel strangely comfortable, while change feels threatening even when it would improve your life. They also lied to you by implying that negative thoughts are the problem, when in reality, thoughts are symptoms. Because what drives your mental patterns is emotional conditioning, stored beneath awareness, shaping which thoughts appear and which ones feel believable. This is why positive thinking often fails, because the brain does not respond to forced optimism when the emotional system beneath it is still calibrated for fear, scarcity, or rejection. When emotional memory contradicts conscious intention, emotional memory wins, because it is faster, older, and tied to survival circuitry that does not wait for rational approval. Another lie you were taught is that your personality is fixed, because while temperament exists, most personality traits are adaptive responses, shaped by early experiences, social feedback, and repeated emotional outcomes rather than immutable traits. What you call who I am is often just who you had to become to feel safe, accepted, or unseen enough to survive past environments. This means confidence, avoidance, people-pleasing, aggression, detachment, perfectionism, and emotional numbness are not identities, but strategies, learned responses that once served a purpose and were never updated. The danger of believing these strategies are your identity is that you stop questioning them, defend them, and build your life around them, even when they are no longer necessary. They also lied to you about motivation, suggesting it comes from willpower, when in reality, motivation follows emotional meaning, because the brain invests energy only in what it perceives as emotionally significant. This is why forcing discipline eventually collapses, because without emotional alignment, effort feels like self-punishment rather than purpose. The mind does not resist effort, it resists meaninglessness. And when actions feel disconnected from identity, safety, or belonging, the brain quietly sabotages them. Another deeply embedded lie is that emotions cloud judgment, because in reality, emotions guide judgment, providing rapid assessments of risk, value, and relevance, long before logic has time to evaluate options. Suppressing emotion does not create clarity, it creates blindness, because information is lost when feeling is ignored. This is why emotionally disconnected people often make decisions that look rational, but lead to dissatisfaction, because they are navigating without internal feedback. What they never explained is that the brain filters reality before you ever experience it, because perception is not objective, but selective, highlighting what aligns with existing beliefs and ignoring what challenges them. This means two people can experience the same event and walk away with entirely different realities, not because one is wrong, but because each brain constructed a version that fit its internal model. Once you understand this, you begin to realize that most conflict is not about truth, but about competing interpretations shaped by emotional history rather than present facts. They lied when they told you memory is reliable, because memory is reconstructed every time you recall it, altered by mood, belief, and current identity, making your past less like a record and more like a story that evolves. This is why trauma feels alive long after the event ends, because the brain keeps updating the memory with present-day emotion, reinforcing the sense that the threat still exists. It is also why people can feel guilt, shame, or regret for events that happened years ago, because emotionally unresolved memories do not fade, they loop. What keeps people trapped is not what happened, but what the brain learned from it, because lessons encoded during emotional intensity feel like truths, even when they were conclusions drawn under stress. This is where the deepest lie lives, because you were taught to trust your thoughts without questioning the emotional context that produced them. Until that context is examined, challenged, and replaced through new emotional experiences, the brain continues operating under outdated rules. The most unsettling realization is that the mind does not seek freedom, it seeks predictability, because predictability reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is perceived as danger. This is why growth feels uncomfortable, healing feels destabilizing, and transformation feels like loss, because the brain interprets unfamiliar states as threats even when they are healthier. Once you see this, you begin to understand that resistance is not laziness or fear, but loyalty to an old system that once kept you safe. And this is where the real work begins. Because breaking free from the lies about the human mind requires not fighting the brain, but retraining it, which means creating new emotional evidence that safety, meaning, and identity can exist beyond the patterns you inherited. This understanding sets the stage for the final revelation, because once you realize how deeply these lies shaped you, you also realize how much power you still have to reshape yourself. What finally becomes impossible to ignore is that the greatest lie ever told about the human mind is that once you understand it, you are free from it, because awareness alone does not undo conditioning. And knowing how your brain works does not automatically stop it from protecting itself, distorting reality, or repeating patterns that once kept you emotionally safe, but now quietly limit your life. The mind does not seek truth first, it seeks certainty, because certainty reduces anxiety, and this is why the brain clings to familiar beliefs even when they cause suffering. Because predictability feels safer than uncertainty, and suffering you understand feels less threatening than change you cannot control. This is why people defend identities that hurt them, stay loyal to narratives that weaken them, and resist information that threatens their worldview. Because the brain interprets belief disruption as danger, not growth, and reacts with fear, denial, or aggression rather than curiosity. What you were never taught is that most of your thoughts are not conclusions, but reflexes, because the brain generates interpretations automatically based on past experiences, emotional memory, and survival bias, meaning what feels like rational thinking is often just emotional pattern recognition, wearing the disguise of logic. Once you see this, it becomes clear why two people can experience the same event and walk away with completely different realities. Because the brain does not record life as it is. It reconstructs it based on expectation, emotional state, and perceived threat. Meaning, reality is not something you observe, but something your mind assembles in real time. This reconstruction process explains why fear amplifies danger, why anxiety narrows perspective, why confidence expands possibility, and why trauma freezes perception, because the brain prioritizes survival relevance over accuracy, shaping what you notice, what you ignore, and what you remember. The lie was never that your mind is powerful, but that it is objective, because objectivity would require neutrality, and the brain is never neutral, since it is constantly filtering information through the question of whether something will protect you, harm you, include you, or exclude you. This is why emotional experiences feel more real than factual ones, because emotion marks memory as important, embedding it deeper into your identity, while neutral information fades quickly, even if it is true. Over time, these emotionally weighted memories begin forming invisible rules about who you are, what you deserve, what is possible, and what is dangerous. And once these rules are established, your brain enforces them automatically, without asking for your permission. This enforcement is subtle, because it does not feel like control. It feels like intuition, common sense, or realism, which is why limiting beliefs are so hard to detect, since they feel like wisdom rather than fear. The most dangerous part of this system is that the brain rewards consistency over accuracy, meaning it prefers information that confirms existing beliefs and resists information that challenges them, even if the challenge would lead to growth or freedom. This is why people feel uncomfortable around ideas that threaten their identity, because the brain experiences identity disruption as psychological death, triggering defense mechanisms that protect the self-image at all costs. Once you understand this, you begin to see why change feels painful, even when it is positive, because the brain must dismantle familiar internal structures before building new ones. And dismantling feels like loss before it feels like liberation. What they never told you is that the mind is not designed to make you happy, fulfilled, or enlightened, because its primary job is to keep you alive and socially accepted, and happiness is secondary if it threatens safety or belonging. This explains why the brain often sabotages success, intimacy, or transformation when it feels unfamiliar, because unfamiliarity triggers uncertainty, and uncertainty triggers fear, even if the unfamiliar outcome would improve your life. The brain would rather keep you in a known struggle than risk an unknown peace, which is why people return to toxic relationships, destructive habits, and limiting environments. Not because they want pain, but because their nervous system recognizes it. What finally breaks the illusion is realizing that your thoughts are not commands, your emotions are not instructions, and your fears are not prophecies, but signals produced by a system that evolved for survival, not truth. This realization does not silence the mind, but it creates distance. And in that distance, you gain choice. Because once you see a thought as a reaction rather than a fact, you can decide whether to follow it or let it pass. True psychological freedom begins when you stop asking whether your thoughts are real and start asking whether they are useful. Because usefulness determines growth, while obsession with certainty keeps you trapped in internal debates that never resolve. This shift allows you to engage with your mind instead of obeying it, to observe fear without submitting to it, and to experience emotion without becoming it, which is the foundation of self-control that no one teaches explicitly. What emerges is not a silent mind, but a grounded one, because awareness does not remove emotion. It prevents emotion from hijacking identity, allowing you to respond instead of react. At this stage, the lie collapses completely, because you realize the human mind is neither enemy nor ally, but a tool, and like any tool, it becomes dangerous when misunderstood and powerful when mastered. Mastery does not mean domination, because suppressing the mind only strengthens it, but understanding its patterns, biases, and fears allows you to work with it instead of against it. And the final truth they never told you is that reality does not change when the world changes, but when your interpretation changes, because the brain is the lens through which life passes. And when the lens shifts, everything you experience shifts with it. Once you understand this, you stop trying to control life and start refining perception, because perception is the real interface between you and reality. And whoever controls perception controls experience. This is where power actually lives, not in motivation, positivity, or discipline, but in awareness of how the mind constructs meaning, moment by moment. Because the moment you stop being ruled by unconscious patterns, you begin living deliberately. And that is the truth they never wanted you to understand, because a person who can observe their own mind cannot be easily manipulated, easily controlled, or easily convinced to live a life that does not belong to them. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.